Imagine you hold like the absolute undeniable secrets of the universe right in your hands. You literally have the ultimate truth.
Right. No pressure.
Yeah, right. And now you have to walk into a room full of tired, distracted people. I mean, they're thinking about their grocery lists or their unread emails, and you have to convince them to actually care about this truth.
Which is incredibly hard to do.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Did you just stand there and read them the raw facts, like hoping the truth does all the heavy lifting? Or do you use calculated psychological manipulation, timing, tone, narrative tension, all to just force them to listen?
Well, I mean, that's the ultimate communicator's dilemma, isn't it? If your message is genuinely flawless, shouldn't it just speak for itself?
And that is exactly the core question we are tackling today. So welcome to this deep dive. Our mission today is to basically deconstruct a massive historical puzzle.
Yeah, and it's a fascinating one.
It really is. We are looking at how a 2,000-year-old tradition took ancient Greco-Roman persuasion techniques. I mean, the literal psychological blueprints used by guys like Aristotle and Cicero to manipulate crowds and collided them with biblical texts to create the modern sermon.
Because, we are dissecting the actual architecture of human persuasion here. And this wasn't just some casual merging of ideas. It was a centuries-long, often agonizing struggle. They were trying to figure out how to move the human will without actually breaking it.
And whether you're, I don't know, prepping for a massive corporate presentation or trying to win an argument with your partner, or you're just fascinated by the psychology of how humans move other humans to action, this deep dive is basically a masterclass in communication. We're looking at the ultimate historical playbook for public speaking.
Right, because the mechanics we're exploring today, they govern how the human brain processes information and emotion and authority. I mean, they are entirely universal.
Totally. Now, before we jump in, just a quick disclaimer for you listening. We are exploring the mechanics, the history, and the communication theories presented in this massive body of source material. We're looking at the how and the why of persuasion, right?
Exactly.
We're not taking sides. We are not endorsing the theological or religious viewpoints presented in this history. We are just impartially unpacking the brilliant and, sometimes controversial ideas contained in these historical texts.
Yeah, I like to think of it like studying the engineering of a massive cathedral. You can marvel at the physics of the flying buttresses without actually needing to attend the service inside,
That is a perfect way to put it. Okay, let's unpack this. We have to start with what historians call the Great Collision. We're going way back to the dawn of the 3rd century.
Yeah.
There's this North African apologist named Tertullian, and he asks a question that basically defines the next 2 millennia of public speaking. He says, what indeed has Athens to do with Jerusalem?
And that single sentence, it captures a monumental culture clash. Because to really understand it, we need to define what those two cities represented in the ancient mind.
Right. They weren't just cities on a map.
No, exactly. Athens wasn't just a place. It was the symbol of the academy, the legacy of Plato and Aristotle and all the Roman rhetoricians. Athens was basically the pinnacle of human logic, debate, and, the artifice of persuasion.
It was the secular intellectual elite, right? The people who could argue that a black dog was actually a white cat just to prove they had the verbal skills to pull it off.
That's a great analogy. Yeah, the rhetoricians were sort of like the high-priced defense attorneys of the ancient world. They could spin anything. Whereas Jerusalem, on the other hand, represented raw revelation, prophecy.
Like the divine speaking directly to humanity.
Right, through fishermen and tent makers, not polished debaters.
So the tension there is just obvious. I was trying to visualize this, and I came up with this analogy. Imagine you have a priceless, absolutely flawless diamond.
Okay, I'm with you.
In this context, the diamond is pure divine revelation, right? Truth driven entirely by the Holy Spirit. Now, you need to deliver this diamond to an audience. Do you just hand them the raw, unpolished rock? Or do you put it in a polished velvet jewelry box?
Right.
And the early thinkers, they were terrified that if they used the velvet box, which represents human rhetorical structures, philosophy, pagan persuasion techniques, that they would somehow cheapen the diamond.
Yeah, they were grappling with a massive epistemological challenge.
Well, let's break that word down for a second. Epistemological.
Sure. So epistemology is just the study of how we know what we know. It's the philosophy of knowledge. So the epistemological challenge for them was, how does a human being actually receive divine truth?
Gotcha.
The early theologians, they feared that if they dressed up the gospel in fancy Greek rhetorical tricks, People might believe the message just because the speaker was charismatic.
Oh, wow. So the faith would be built on a clever sales pitch.
Exactly. Not on actual organic belief. They felt divine truth shouldn't need, like, a marketing team.
But history tells us they didn't just throw away the velvet box, right? They didn't just hand people the raw rock and walk away.
No, they didn't. And the reason why is rooted in a very pragmatic realization. While the substance of their message, the diamond, was viewed as divine, the communicative medium is inescapably human.
Right. I mean, we only have human language.
Exactly. Human language, human vocal cords, and our very limited human cognitive capacities to work with.
So if you're stuck using a human medium, you might as well use the absolute most effective version of it.
Yeah, that basically became the theological imperative. Making the medium clear and emotionally resonant and highly persuasive, it wasn't seen as a compromise anymore. If you hold the ultimate truth, it becomes your absolute duty to communicate it with maximum effectiveness.
You owe it to the message to present it well.
Right, you have to.
That makes a lot of sense. So they decided to build the best velvet box the world had ever seen. And to do that, they borrowed the blueprints from the absolute masters of the Greek and Roman titans.
Yeah, what we call the 5 canons of rhetoric.
Right. These are basically the sequential steps for building a speech from the ground up, right?
Yeah, it was codified by the ancients and essentially became the rule book for preparing a Christian sermon.
Let's walk through them, because this isn't just ancient history. I mean, this is literally how a TED Talk is built today.
Oh, absolutely.
So the first is inventio, or invention. And this isn't about, like, making things up, right?
No, it's the discovery of the available means of persuasion. It's sitting down with your topic and excavating the arguments. You're surveying the landscape. Like, what facts do I have? What emotional levers can I pull? What does this specific audience actually care about?
You're just gathering your raw materials.
Exactly.
Okay, so once you have a pile of materials,
Right.
you hit the second canon, dispositio or arrangement. This is the structural organization. And this is where the psychology really starts to come in, doesn't it?
Oh, massively. Because the order in which you present information drastically changes how it's received. I mean, if you're trying to persuade a hostile audience, you don't lead with your most controversial point.
Right, they just tune you out immediately.
Exactly. You start with common ground, you build a foundation of agreement, and then you slowly arrange your arguments to lead them to a conclusion they previously would have just flat out rejected.
You're building a psychological ramp. I love that. Then we have the third canon, elocutio, which is style.
Yes, the aesthetics of the language.
Right, the vocabulary, the metaphors. It's the difference between saying, we're going to have a hard time, versus Winston Churchill saying, I have nothing to offer but blood, toil, tears, and sweat.
Beautifully put. Style is what makes the arrangement memorable. It captures the imagination.
Now, the fourth canon is where I really want to push back a bit. Memoria, or memory.
Okay, hit me.
We're talking about the literal memorization of the speech. In an era where every politician has a teleprompter and every corporate speaker has, like, an iPad or a slide deck, isn't memorization kind of a dead art? Why was this on the same level as the actual arguments?
It's easy to dismiss memory as just a parlor trick, but the classical view and the view adopted by these early preachers saw it entirely differently. Memory is not about reciting lines. It's a psychological technique for establishing authority.
Wait, how does remembering a speech give you authority?
Well, think about the last time you watched someone give a speech where they were constantly looking down at their notes. What happens to the energy in the room?
Oh, it completely dies. You feel like you're being read, I don't know, a terms of service agreement.
Exactly. The physical act of looking down breaks the connection. A barrier goes up. But when a speaker has used memoria, when they've internalized the message so completely that it's a part of them, they can stand unencumbered.
They can actually look at the audience.
Right. They maintain unbroken eye contact. They project an authoritative presence because the audience subconsciously registers that this person isn't just delivering a script. They're embodying a conviction.
Oh, wow. The message lives inside them. That is powerful. I mean, when someone looks you dead in the eye and delivers a hard truth, you feel it in your chest. You do not get that from screen.
You really don't. And the final canon completes that exact thought. Pronunciatio, or actio, which is delivery.
The physical execution.
Right. Vocal modulation, the cadence of your voice, your hand gestures. It's the physical manifestation of all the previous steps combined.
Okay, so those are the steps to actually build the speech. But what about the underlying mechanics of the persuasion itself? Like, how do you actually get inside the listener's head?
Well, that brings us to Aristotle's famous triad, logos, ethos, and pathos.
I think most people have a vague memory of these from, like, high school English. But seeing how they were adapted for the pulpit is honestly mind-blowing.
Aristotle viewed rhetoric as a pragmatic science. He wanted universal principles that worked on human beings, regardless of whether you were selling grain in the market or defending a general in the Senate.
So let's start with logos. Normally, we think of logos as pure logic, reason, or empirical evidence, right? But in the context of sacred rhetoric, the speaker isn't allowed to just invent a clever philosophical argument, are they?
No, and this is a really crucial adaptation. In this tradition, logos is intimately tied to exegesis.
Let's define exegesis real quick.
Sure, exegesis is simply the critical explanation or interpretation of a text. So the Christian orator is tasked with excavating the divine logos, the divine logic, directly from the biblical text.
So the preacher is essentially a discoverer, not an inventor.
Right. The argument must be drawn from what's already written. I mean, if a speaker stands up and delivers a brilliantly logical 30-minute argument about why we should be kind to each other, but they don't anchor it in the text they're supposed to be preaching from, they've failed the test of sacred logos.
Wow. Okay. Next is pathos, the appeal to emotion. There's always been this, like, hyper-rationalist suspicion of pathos, hasn't there? Like, it's a cheap parlor trick to just make people cry.
Oh, absolutely. We still see that today in corporate environments. You hear, let's leave emotion out of this and just look at the data.
Right. All the time.
But classical theorists and early church fathers who adopted them, they understood a profound reality about human nature. True rhetoric cannot just inform the intellect.
Because if you only inform the intellect, the person doesn't actually do anything.
Exactly. You might change their mind, but it takes emotion to get them out of their chair. Pathos is the engine that moves the human will. A speech that lacks pathos fails the ultimate rhetorical test because it leaves the listener's volition, their choices, and actions totally unchanged.
That makes total sense.
Yeah.
I mean, you can use logos to convince someone that smoking is destroying their lungs. The data is undeniable.
Right.
But until you connect with their pathos, like their fear of not being alive to walk their daughter down the aisle, they aren't going to throw the pack away.
You need the logic to build the track, but you need the emotion to drive the train.
Oh, I love that. Which brings us to the third pillar, which Aristotle considered perhaps the most controlling factor of all ethos, the perceived character of the speaker.
Because in the ancient world, if your character was suspect, your logic didn't matter. The audience would completely reject you.
And for the Christian preacher, this takes on an immense, almost terrifying weight. The historical sources use this Greek concept of the character.
Yes, the character. That translates to the herald. Think of a herald in an ancient kingdom. They ride into a village, unroll a scroll, and declare a new law. They don't speak on their own authority, right? They speak on behalf of the king.
But the people in the village have to actually believe that this guy came from the king.
That is the crux of it. The herald's authority derives from their perceived authenticity and integrity. If the herald is known to be a corrupt liar who takes bribes, the village will laugh him out of town even if he's holding the king's actual seal.
Whoa.
For the preacher, an audience simply will not submit to the ethical and spiritual demands of a sermon if they doubt the moral character of the person delivering it.
We see this all the time today, don't we? If a brilliant financial advisor gives you a watertight, logical strategy for your portfolio, but you find out they're secretly bankrupt and being investigated for fraud, their logos is completely neutralized by their ruined ethos.
Exactly. And this maps perfectly onto a standard set by Quintilian, a Roman educator from the 1st century. He coined the gold standard for a public speaker, vir bonus dicendi peritus, the good man speaking well.
So he was insisting that skill without morality is actually dangerous.
Yes. Quintilian insisted that rhetorical skill stripped of moral virtue wasn't true oratory. It was dangerous, manipulative sophistry. A highly skilled speaker without a moral compass is just a con artist with a microphone.
And the early church took this pagan ideal and basically said, yes, exactly this. They recognized that how a preacher lived their life outside the pulpit possessed vastly greater persuasive force than their verbal eloquence inside it.
Which leads to some incredibly vivid metaphors about what the speaker is actually doing to the audience.
Yes. Okay, we have to talk about this historical figure from the 4th century, John Chrysostom. His name literally translates to golden mouth because he was such a legendary orator, right?
He was.
He was preaching in places like Antioch and Constantinople, dealing with massive crowds that would applaud and shout and sometimes even riot. He wrote a treatise called De Sacerdotio on the priesthood,
Yeah.
and he uses this intense medical imagery to describe persuasion.
Chrysostom is the perfect embodiment of this synthesis because he pointed out a very frustrating reality for a pastor. You can't use physical force or political power or coercion to change a congregation. You can't put them in jail for being greedy.
Right.
You only have the power of persuasive speech. So he compared the preacher to a physician of souls.
And a physician has a whole bag of tools. Chrysostom talked about how the speaker has to balance the scalpel of divine judgment with the soothing medicine of divine grace.
Now, think about how that beautifully balances ethos and pathos. If a surgeon only uses the scalpel, constantly cutting, condemning, and judging, the patient bleeds out in despair. They leave the church and never come back.
Yeah, of course.
But if the physician only applies soothing medicine and bandages without ever actually cutting out the infection, the patient dies of the disease.
So you have to have the moral authority, the ethos, for the audience to trust you with the scalpel. And you need the deep empathy, the pathos, to apply the medicine.
It requires an incredibly high level of emotional intelligence from the speaker.
It's a staggering responsibility. So we see these classical tools being used with incredible effect in the East by people like Chrysostom. But there was still a lot of hesitation in the broader church, wasn't there? Like using pagan tools for sacred work still needed a massive formal theological green light.
Right.
That brings us to a titan of Western thought, Augustine of Hippo, and his monumental work, De Doctrina Christiana.
Published in phases around the turn of the 5th century. I mean, if there's a single text that became the foundational manual for Western communication for the next 1,000 years, it's this one.
And Augustine was fascinating because before he became a bishop, he was a professor of rhetoric in Milan. He was a secular elite. He knew these manipulative classical tools better than anyone.
Exactly.
When he converted, he struggled with whether he should use them. And I absolutely love the analogy he used to finally justify it. He called it plundering the Egyptians.
It is a brilliant piece of theological framing.
It draws from the Exodus narrative.
Yeah.
The Israelites are escaping slavery in Egypt, and as they leave, God tells them to ask the Egyptians for their gold and silver. So they take all this pagan treasure. Later on in the wilderness, they melt down that Egyptian gold to forge the sacred vessels for the tabernacle.
Right.
Augustine looks at that and says, that is exactly what we are doing with Greek rhetoric. We aren't compromising our faith. We're stealing the culture's best weapons and repurposing them for truth.
He completely flipped the narrative. Instead of rhetoric being a dirty compromise, it became a spoil of war. In Book 4 of his work, he unpacks a defense of this that is just devastatingly logical.
Walk us through his core argument.
Augustine takes a very pragmatic look at the world. He essentially asks, the enemies of truth are highly trained. They use the art of eloquence to persuade people of absolute falsehoods, destructive heresies, and lies.
Sure.
If the liars are using brilliant psychology to win over the masses, why on earth should the defenders of truth choose to stand up there unarmed, boring, and inarticulate?
I mean, if the guy lying to the crowd is maintaining perfect eye contact, pacing his narrative perfectly, and dialing up the pathos, and the guy telling the truth is just mumbling into a piece of paper in a monotone voice,
Yeah.
the lie is going to win.
Every single time. Truth does not automatically win just by virtue of being true. It must be championed effectively. You have to fight fire with fire.
Wow. So Augustine formally integrates the tools of the Roman philosopher Cicero into Christian preaching. He creates what we call the 3 styles of preaching. Let's walk through these because it's basically a diagnostic tool for how to match your tone to your content.
Okay.
The first is the subdued style. What's the goal here?
The primary duty of the subdued style is doser to teach. This appeals almost entirely to logos. If you're explaining a complex point of ancient history or breaking down the syntax of a difficult verse, you don't want fireworks. You want clarity, precision, and careful exposition.
So you strip away the heavy ornamentation so the intellect can just grasp at the facts.
Right.
Then you have the moderate style, mapped to the duty to delight, or delectare.
This is where you bring the aesthetic beauty. You use this for praise, thanksgiving, or casting a vision. You use beautiful phrasing, rhythmic sentences, vivid metaphors. The goal is to make the truth aesthetically pleasing so it captures the listener's imagination. You want them to enjoy the message.
And finally, the grand style, mapped to the duty to persuade or move, flector or mover. I found this really surprising, actually, because when I hear grand style, I picture someone using huge $10 words and incredibly complex sentence structures. But that's not what it means, is it?
Not at all. The grand style is not about flowery vocabulary. It is about raw, intense pathos. The grand style is what you use when you need the human will to move to immediate radical action. We're talking about deep repentance, abandoning a destructive lifestyle, or in the early church, being willing to face martyrdom.
I want to test this. Let's do a quick role play.
Yeah.
Let's say I'm trying to convince you to donate to a local animal shelter. If I use the subdued style, I'd say, our shelter took in 400 dogs last year. Our operating costs are up 20%, and a $50 donation covers vaccinations for one animal. It's just the facts.
Exactly. I understand the math, but I might just put the flyer in my pocket and forget about it, you know?
Okay, what if I shift to the grand style? I'd say something like, right now, it is freezing outside. There is a golden retriever puppy shivering in a concrete run, terrified, looking at the door, waiting for someone to show up. We have the space, we have the medicine, but if we don't get funding by midnight, we have to turn the heat off in that wing. We need your help tonight.
Okay, hand me my wallet.
Right. But let's break down why that worked. I didn't use big words. I used simple, urgent language.
What you did was bypass the analytical buffer and go straight for the volition. You painted a vivid emotional picture, you introduced urgency, and you demanded an immediate response. That is the grand style. It's the impetuous expression of a soul on fire.
I love that. So Augustine synthesizes all of this into one lasting rule, and it's brilliant.
He concluded that rhetoric without exegesis, having amazing delivery but no grounding in the actual truth of the text, is just eloquent nonsense. You sound great, but you're feeding people cotton candy.
But the reverse is just as bad, isn't it? Exegesis, without rhetoric, having the dry facts perfectly aligned but no ability to communicate them, means your truth is locked in an academic study, totally inaccessible to the people bleeding out in the real world.
You must have both. The diamond and the velvet box?
Okay, so Augustine establishes this beautiful, powerful balance. But humans have a tendency to ruin a good thing. As we move into the Middle Ages, the pendulum swings wildly in the other direction. Things get, well, weirdly mathematical.
Yes, we entered the era of the ars predicandi, the art of preaching, spanning roughly the 12th to the 15th centuries.
This is the era of the scholastic university sermon. Universities are popping up across Europe. Oxford, Paris, Bologna. They want things to be highly intellectual, rigorous, and standardized. And the manual writers of the time literally compared their sermon outlines to the growth of a botanical tree.
It was an exercise in extreme logical subdivision.
Let's trace this tree, because it gets incredibly complicated. First, you have the root, which they called the theme. This was just a short, single quotation from the Bible that served as the foundation. Easy enough.
Then you move to the trunk, the pro-theme. This was a secondary text that logically led into an opening prayer to secure the audience's attention.
Okay, still with you. Then we hit the branches, known as the division. This is where you logically split the primary theme into distinct conceptual parts. And you do this using dialectics, etymology, and 4 different senses of scriptural interpretation.
And if that wasn't enough, you arrive at the foliage and fruit, the subdivision, and expansion. You break those branches down even further using syllogisms, maxims, and moral stories called exempla.
Honestly, as someone who loves a good speech, reading about this made my head spin.
Right.
This doesn't sound like a speech that moves the heart. It sounds like a guy standing at a chalkboard doing complex calculus in front of an audience of peasant farmers.
Right.
So the obvious question is, did this actually work? Did the everyday person get anything out of this?
That is the exact problem. The historical sources indicate that this era succumbed to a disease known as hyperscholasticism.
Which means what exactly?
It means the preachers became obsessed with the mechanics of the logos to the exclusion of everything else. Sermons frequently devolved into mechanical displays of verbal dexterity. A preacher would stand up and essentially show off their ability to subdivide a concept into 14 different subpoints.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it prioritized intellectual gymnastics and false subtleties over actually transforming the listener.
So they completely lost the pathos. They lost the heart. The audience must have been exhausted. I mean, if I go to a speech wanting hope for my terrible week, and the speaker gives me an etymological breakdown of a Latin verb, I'm going to stop listening.
And that profound audience fatigue, that disconnect, is exactly what sparked a massive rhetorical backlash during the Renaissance and the Protestant Reformation.
Which brings us to a revolutionary figure, a German theologian named Philip Melanchthon. He looks at this medieval math equation preaching and says, this is fundamentally broken. Now, classical rhetoric had 3 main genres of speech: forensic used in courtrooms for accusing or defending, deliberative used in politics for future policies, and epideictic used for ceremonies, to praise or blame. Melanchthon looks at those and says, none of these fit what a pastor is supposed to do.
Because he realized that the goal of the Reformation pulpit wasn't to argue a court case or put on a ceremonial display. The goal was the clear, systematic instruction of ordinary people in biblical dogma. So he invented a completely new fourth genre.
The genus didascalicum. Try saying that 5 times fast.
It is quite the Latin mouthful, but it simply translates to the didactic or instructional genre.
And the entire point of the genus didascalicum was dialectical clarity, right? Simplify the language, simplify the syntax, prioritize clear pedagogical instruction over all the ornate, excessive medieval styling. It essentially paved the way for modern expository preaching. Just tell the people what the text means.
And we see this push for absolute clarity taken even further in England with the Puritans.
Yes, there was a manual written in 1592 by William Perkins called The Art of Prophesying. He aggressively advocated for what he called the plain style.
And the plain style is historically fascinating because it is defined almost entirely by what it lacked.
No pastiches of Latin quotes thrown in just to make the speaker sound smart. No self-serving ornamentation, no showing off. The Puritan ideal was that the power of the sermon must lie in the unadorned truth of the text, not in the artificial brilliance of the speaker. The speaker should be invisible.
It was a complete rejection of the speaker trying to be the star of the show.
But hold on a second. If they're stripping away all the ornamentation, all the rhetorical flourish, and just trying to read the text plainly, doesn't that take us right back to our original problem? Aren't they just handing the audience the raw, unpolished diamond and refusing to use the velvet box? How do they justify using any rhetorical techniques to adapt the message to a 16th century audience?
That tension leads to one of the most profound theological frameworks we're going to discuss today. John Calvin's doctrine of accommodatio, or divine accommodation.
This concept absolutely blew my mind. Walk us through Calvin's logic here.
So Calvin started with a philosophical absolute. The infinite, transcendent God is fundamentally incomprehensible to the finite, fallen human mind.
Right.
The gap between God's intellect and our intellect is infinite. We cannot cross it. Therefore, for God to communicate with humanity at all, he must cross the gap. He must accommodate himself. He deliberately adjusts, dumbs down, and translates his discourse to fit the limited cognitive and linguistic capacities of human beings.
And he uses this incredibly memorable image to explain it. He likened God to a mother or a nurse lisping to a small child.
It is a beautiful, startling metaphor. Think about how a parent speaks to a toddler. They use baby talk. They use exaggerated facial expressions. They simplify complex dangers into basic rules like hot, don't touch. Now, the reality of the parent's message, the love, the instruction, the protection is not diminished by the baby talk. But the delivery mechanism is drastically adapted so the child can actually grasp it without being overwhelmed by adult physics.
The parent limits their own vocabulary out of love for the listener. So if we pull this forward to the public speaker, the implication is massive.
It is a strict theological mandate. If God himself uses human language, cultural metaphors, and rhetorical accommodation to adapt to our limitations, then modern preachers are obligated to do exactly the same for their contemporary audiences.
You aren't just allowed to adapt the ancient text to modern ears. You are failing your job if you don't. If a speaker just reads a 2,000-year-old text with ancient cultural references without translating the emotional and cultural weight into the modern vernacular, they aren't being faithful to the text. They're actually refusing to lisp to the child.
Right, they're speaking adult physics to a toddler and blaming the toddler for not understanding.
Wow. Okay, so we've covered the sweeping macro history. We've gone from Tertullian's anxiety in Africa to Augustine's Roman heist through the medieval mathematical trees and into the Reformation's push for clarity. But before a speaker can translate the message to the audience, they have to actually extract the true meaning from the ancient text itself.
Yes, we need to move from the macro structure to the micromechanics. How do you read the blueprint?
This brings us to a field called discourse grammar, championed by modern linguists like Stephen Runge. And this represents a major shift from how a lot of people were taught to study ancient texts, doesn't it?
Historically, biblical exegesis focused heavily on semantics. Semantics asks, what does this specific word mean in the dictionary? You do a word study, find the Greek root, and call it a day.
Right.
But Runge and discourse grammarians shifted the focus to pragmatics.
Pragmatics, meaning we aren't just asking what a word means. We're asking what a grammatical choice accomplishes within the flow of communication.
Exactly. It's looking at the function of the language. How is the author trying to manipulate the reader's attention?
The core concept here is the distinction between unmarked and marked structures. I was trying to figure out how to explain this, and I realized we do this every day in our emails. An unmarked structure is just standard default text. Subject, verb, object. It's baseline information.
Simple enough.
But a marked structure is like when you're typing an email and you suddenly use all cap ES or bold text or italics. When the reader sees that bold text, they instantly know, the writer's doing something deliberate here. This is the main point.
Exactly.
But the ancient Greek and Hebrew manuscripts didn't have bold text or italics. So how did the ancient authors bold their text?
That is exactly what discourse grammar reveals. When an ancient author deviates from the standard grammatical pattern, it is almost never an accident. It is a deliberate rhetorical choice to signal prominence, contrast, or emphasis.
Let's go through some of these specific linguistic markers because this is literally a how-to guide for spotting ancient emphasis. The first one is called a syndeton.
A syndeton is the deliberate omission of conjunctions, words like and, but, or between clauses.
So instead of a normal sentence like, I went to the store and I bought milk and I came home, you strip the glue out. I went, I bought, I returned. Julius Caesar's famous Veni, Vidi, Vici, right? I came, I saw, I conquered.
Precisely. And the linguistic function of doing that is to create rapid narrative pacing. It speeds up the listener's mental processing, often to introduce a startling climax or a very sharp contrast. The author is hitting the gas pedal.
Next up are forward-pointing devices.
This is when an author uses a pronoun or a particle to deliberately delay the main point. Think of a modern phrase like, here is the deal, or listen to this.
It builds suspense. You're forcing the listener to lean in before you drop the payload.
It slows down the discourse to build psychological tension. It heightens the audience's attention right before a major revelation. The grammar is literally telling the modern speaker, pause here, build tension, don't rush this sentence.
The grammar dictates the vocal delivery. I love that. Third is the historical present tense.
This is using present tense verbs right in the middle of a past tense narrative. So you're reading a story and it goes, Jesus went to the sea, he saw the crowds, and he says to them.
It acts as a spotlight. We do this when we tell stories at a bar. So I was walking down the street yesterday and I looked up and this guy runs right into me. It brings the climactic action right into the immediate present, demanding the reader's attention.
And recognizing where the historical present happens in the ancient text tells the preacher exactly where the emotional peak of the scene is located.
And the last one listed is redundant quotative frames. What is that?
It's the unnecessary repetition of speech markers. For example, writing, he answered and said, semantically, you don't need both words. He answered carries all the necessary meaning.
But pragmatically, why include both?
When the biblical authors use that redundancy, it functions as a major stop sign. It signals a significant shift in the speaker, a change in the audience being addressed, or a major pivot in the thematic subject. It tells the reader, pay close attention to what follows. The topic is shifting.
So if a speaker is doing their homework, they go into the Greek, they spot the ascendanton, they see the redundant frames, and their sermon outline and their vocal delivery should mirror that exact prominence. You don't just read it flatly. You speed up where the text speeds up. You pause where the text pauses.
Exactly. The grammar explicitly dictates the homiletics.
There is one more macro-rhetorical structure we have to cover, and it's massive in ancient literature. Chiasmus. How does this work?
Chiasmus is an inverted parallel structure. The easiest way to visualize it is as a conceptual sandwich. The structure goes A, B, C, B prime, A prime.
So the first point A matches the last point A prime. The second point B matches the second to last point B prime. And right in the middle is the C element.
Like an arrow pointing directly to the center. It serves a mnemonic function, making oral traditions easier to memorize, but more importantly, it serves an emphatic function. The central focal point of a chiasm, the C element, is structurally highlighted as the theological core of the passage.
So the text gives a stark warning here for public speakers. If you're preaching a passage and you outline it linearly, point 1, point 2, point 3, but the text is actually a chiasm, you might spend 40 minutes preaching the peripheral A and B points, completely miss the C element, and entirely miss the actual proposition the ancient author was trying to make.
Yeah, it's a failure of exegesis that inevitably leads to a failure of rhetoric. You are speaking loudly about the wrong thing.
Okay, so the speaker has done the grueling work. They've dug into the Greek, they've mapped the chiasms, they understand the historical context, they have a massive pile of data. But gathering facts isn't a speech, It's a lecture. It's a data dump. How does a speaker fuse all this information into a single piercing message that a modern audience can digest?
This is where we introduce a titan of 20th century preaching, Haddon Robinson. He revolutionized expository preaching with a concept simply called the big idea.
His fundamental rule was that a sermon must be a bullet, not buckshot. I love that imagery. If you fire a shotgun, you hit a lot of things superficially. You graze the audience with a dozen different historical facts. But a bullet hits one thing with penetrating, stopping force. A sermon needs a single, unifying concept.
And Robinson provided a very strict, logical formula for discovering this concept, which he called the exegetical idea. It consists of two parts, the subject and the complement.
Let's break this formula down. The subject is, what exactly is the biblical author talking about? And you can't just give a one-word topic, right? You can't say the subject is love or the subject is money.
A topic is too broad. A subject needs to be a precise, complete question that the text is attempting to answer. For example, why should a Christian give their money to the poor?
And the complement is simply, what is the biblical author saying about that subject? What is the answer to the question?
When you synthesize the subject and the complement, you get the exegetical idea. It is a single, historically accurate sentence summarizing what the text meant to its original audience.
Let's use the example from the research. We are looking at the Apostle Paul writing to the Corinthians in the first century about athletic games. The exegetical idea is, because the Apostle Paul viewed his ministry as an athletic contest with eternal stakes, he subjected himself to severe physical and spiritual discipline to avoid disqualification.
Now, that is a perfectly accurate, beautifully researched historical statement. The problem is, it remains trapped in antiquity.
Right. My modern audience isn't the Apostle Paul, and they aren't living in first century Corinth watching the Isthmian Games. If I just read them that sentence, they'll say, good for Paul, and go back to sleep.
Exactly.
So we need to build what is called the hermeneutical bridge. We have to translate that historical exegetical idea into a modern homiletical idea, or the sermon proposition.
This is the critical step. You strip away the historical particulars, Paul, Corinth, ancient athletic games, and you extract the timeless universal theological principle.
And the formula for this homiletical idea is highly specific. It needs to be a catchy 15 to 18 word present tense sentence utilizing active verbs. So our long historical sentence about Paul transforms into this. In order to run well, we have to train well.
It is short, it is punchy, it is memorable, and the speaker will repeat it strategically throughout the sermon to anchor the audience's attention.
Now, I have to play devil's advocate here. If we take a massive, complex, deeply spiritual ancient text and we boil it down to a catchy 15-word slogan that sounds like it belongs on a corporate motivational poster, don't we risk losing the soul and the emotion of the text? It feels sterile. It feels like a platitude.
That is a very valid critique. If a speaker stops there, the sermon will be dry, moralistic, and ultimately unpersuasive. Train well to run well. Okay, sure, but why should I care? This raises the critical question. How do we inject the pathos back in?
Because we established earlier that without pathos, the wheel doesn't move.
Exactly. To solve this, the text introduces Bryan Chapell's concept of the FCF, the fallen condition focus.
A fallen condition focus. Break that down for us.
Chapell posits that no biblical text was written in a vacuum just to share interesting trivia. Every text was originally written to address some specific aspect of human brokenness, sin, or frailty. The FCF is the mutual human condition that is shared by both the ancient audience and the modern congregation sitting in the room.
So we were talking about universal human struggles. Anxiety, pride, the fear of death, jealousy, the desire for control, the pain of betrayal.
Yes. Human nature has not changed in 2,000 years. By explicitly identifying the FCF early in the message, the speaker anchors the big idea in deep, recognizable pathos. You aren't just giving them a catchy slogan. You are rhetorically binding their contemporary private suffering directly to the ancient texts.
It answers the audience's internal subconscious question, why do I need to hear this today? Because you, the listener, just like the ancient Corinthians, are exhausted. You are struggling with discipline. You're terrified of failing. When the speaker exposes that shared nerve, the divine resolution, the grace in the text feels profoundly necessary and emotionally resonant, rather than just being a dry lecture on ancient history.
It builds an emotional bridge across time.
Okay, so we have a great big idea, and we have tapped into the human struggle through the FCF, but we still have to physically deliver this package to a modern audience. And let's be honest, modern audiences are tough, they're skeptical, they have short attention spans, and they're one buzz away from looking at their phone.
Oh, absolutely.
The research shifts here to talk about metaphors and modern narrative arcs.
Specifically, it brings in cognitive linguistics and conceptual metaphor theory, or CMT, pioneered by scholars like George Lakoff and Mark Johnson.
When I first read conceptual metaphor theory, my eyes kind of glazed over, but the application is incredibly practical. CMT argues that human cognition is fundamentally embodied. We do not understand abstract thought in a vacuum. We understand it through our physical bodily experiences in the world.
It's true. We use spatial and physical metaphors for abstract concepts all the time without realizing it. Up is good. I'm feeling high. Things are looking up. He climbed the corporate ladder. Down is bad. I'm feeling down. The market crashed. Affection is warmth. She gave me a warm greeting. He is an icy person. We map physical realities onto abstract ideas so our brains can process them.
And the research points out that biblical tropes like "the Lord is my shepherd" or "I am the bread of life" aren't just pretty poetry. They're deeply engineered cognitive mechanisms. They transferred the visceral, daily, physical realities of ancient farming life onto the transcendent, invisible reality of God.
But here is the challenge for the modern communicator. If you're preaching in downtown Manhattan to an urban audience that has never seen a sheep, has never sheared one, and doesn't bake their own bread from scratch, those metaphors lose their cognitive weight. The physical mapping fails.
So the speaker must translate that ancient metaphor so it carries the exact same emotional and cognitive impact today. The research gives a brilliant example of this from Pope Francis. He was talking to his priests about pastoral care, a very abstract concept. He told them they need to be shepherds with the odor of the sheep.
That is a visceral, embodied metaphor. It completely remaps the concept. It doesn't just mean be a good leader in a corner office. It means you have to be so intimately involved in the messy, smelly, difficult, chaotic lives of your people that you literally start to smell like them. It grounds an abstract theological concept into a shared human experience of physical proximity and grime.
And this translation of imagery becomes especially crucial when handling difficult or highly controversial texts. Let's talk about the Old Testament imprecatory psalms.
The imprecatory psalms. These are the passages where the biblical writer is violently praying for their enemies to be destroyed, dash their infants against the rocks, and things like that.
Right. If a speaker just reads that plainly on a Sunday morning, a modern audience will be severely alienated. It sounds barbaric. It sounds like a manual for personal vengeance.
But this is where rhetorical analysis and the FCF reframe everything. When you analyze the historical context, these aren't prayers of petty personal revenge. They are the desperate cries of people who have been victims of horrific systemic violence and genocide. When framed through the FCF, the shared human experience of being oppressed and longing for justice against untouchable evil, they are revealed as eschatological cries.
Let's define eschatological for our listeners real quick.
Sure. Eschatological refers to the ultimate, end-of-the-world final judgment. It is the belief that God will ultimately balance the scales of cosmic justice.
So the speaker translates this difficult ancient text into a rhetorically charged plea for divine intervention. And suddenly, modern people who watch the news, who see profound systemic injustice, who feel helpless against corrupt systems, can deeply relate to that cry for justice. The text goes from being alienating to deeply cathartic.
The speaker has successfully remapped the metaphor.
Now, the final structural piece the research outlines is how to actually arrange this journey for the listener. We talked about the medieval tree, which was highly deductive. Point 1, point 2, point 3. Here's the thesis, here are the proofs. But modern audiences resist that, don't they?
We have been fundamentally rewired by digital media, cinema, and narrative entertainment. A purely didactic, deductive lecture often causes modern listeners to immediately tune out. They don't want a math equation, they want a story.
Enter Eugene Lowry and Lowry's loop. He developed a narrative homiletic. He argued that a sermon shouldn't be a static outline. It should be a dynamic plot that mirrors the psychological process of how humans actually experience tension and solve problems. And he broke it down into 5 wonderfully named steps. Let's walk through this, and I want to map it onto a movie plot so we can see how universal this psychology is. Let's use The Matrix or Star Wars.
So it maps perfectly onto the classic hero's journey.
So step 1 is the oops, upsetting the equilibrium. This is where you introduce the conflict or the problem. It aligns perfectly with introducing the FCF. You start by showing the audience that something in the world, or in their heart, is fundamentally wrong.
Right. In Star Wars, this is Luke Skywalker stuck on a moisture farm, realizing his life is going nowhere, and then his aunt and uncle are killed by the Empire. The equilibrium is shattered. the problem is established.
Step 2 is analyzing the discrepancy. This is where the speaker utilizes pathos to deepen the tension. You don't rush to the solution. You let the audience truly feel the weight, the frustration, and the seemingly insurmountable nature of the problem. You let them sit in the desperation.
This is the heroes getting stuck in the trash compactor on the Death Star. The walls are closing in. In a speech, this is when you say, we've tried therapy, we've tried medication, we've tried working harder, and we are still miserable. Nothing is working.
You maximize the pain. Then comes step 3, the aha. Disclosing the clue to resolution. This is the pivot point. This is where the homiletical idea, the big idea, provides a sudden, illuminating shift in perspective. It's the grace breaking through.
The light bulb moment. In The Matrix, it's Neo finally realizing he is the one and stopping the bullets in midair. The rules of the problem have just been rewritten by a higher truth.
Step 4 is the we. Experiencing the grace or the resolution. The tension is alleviated. You celebrate the truth that was just discovered.
The Death Star blows up. The audience takes a massive collective breath of relief.
And finally, step 5 is the
Yeah.
anticipating the consequences. This is the practical application. How will we live differently tomorrow morning because of what we just discovered? Oops. Oh, aha, yeah.
What is so powerful about Lowry's loop is that it perfectly honors the cognitive processes of modern audiences. Rather than bluntly stating the answer up front in a dry thesis statement, which ruins the movie, the speaker acts as a guide. They lead the audience on an emotional journey through tension to a deeply satisfying resolution. When the audience feels like they discovered the truth alongside the speaker, it is immensely more persuasive.
Which brings us to the final and perhaps most important section of our deep dive, the ethics of persuasion. Because when you step back and look at all these tools we've unpacked, psychological narrative loops, calculated pathos, manipulating tension, extracting deep psychological pain points through the FCF, matching vocal delivery to ancient grammatical markers, we are talking about immense, almost frightening power over human emotions.
These are highly potent psychological weapons, and the historical potential for abuse is vast.
So I have to ask the ultimate question. What is the boundary line? With all these tools in the velvet box, what separates ethical persuasion from flat-out coercive manipulation?
The research draws a very clear, hard line based on both secular communication theory and homiletics. Manipulation occurs when a speaker intentionally bypasses the rational faculties of the audience, the logos, and relies exclusively on emotional coercion, pathos, or the blind assertion of their own authority, ethos, to force an outcome.
So manipulation is shutting down their brain and just hijacking their feelings. Don't think about the math, just look at the shivering puppy and give me your money.
Exactly. Coercion restricts choice. It manufactures an artificial crisis to force a desired decision in the moment. Cult leaders use coercion. Ethical persuasion, on the other hand, honors the intellectual freedom and the agency of the listener. It presents the truth clearly, uses emotion to highlight the importance of that truth, but ultimately allows the listener to freely respond.
This ties all the way back to our friend from the 1st century, Quintilian. The vir bonus, the good man speaking well. Sacred rhetoric demands absolute transparency. The emotional weight of the delivery must match the actual objective weight of the text.
If a preacher manufactures a fake emotional crisis, or pretends to cry, or plays manipulative background music just to force an altar call, they are violating the fundamental theological mandate of truth-telling. They are trusting the velvet box more than the diamond. Ethical rhetoric allows the majesty of the truth itself to persuade the conscience, rather than using oratorical tricks to subjugate the human will.
It is about a profound, unwavering respect for the agency of the listener. Wow. Okay, let's summarize this incredible journey we've been on. We started with Tertullian agonizing over whether to put the diamond of divine truth into the velvet box of human rhetoric. We watched Augustine essentially steal Cicero's tools by plundering the Egyptians and proving that the defenders of truth shouldn't fight unarmed. We thought the hyperlogical math equations of the Middle Ages give way to Calvin's beautiful, humbling image of a God who lisps to us like a mother. And we zoomed all the way into the microscopic Greek grammar of Stephen Runge before zooming back out to build a psychological narrative loop that guides human hearts from the desperation of oops to the revelation of aha.
It is a 2,000-year evolution of the mechanics of human connection. The tools have been refined, but the goal has always been the same. How do we get truth from one heart into another?
And here's the application for you, the listener. Whether you are standing behind a pulpit on a Sunday morning, sitting in a boardroom pitching a new strategy to a skeptical manager, or just sitting across a coffee table trying to give life-saving advice to a friend who is struggling, these ancient tools are universally powerful. Discovering a single big idea connecting through shared human brokenness and leading people through a narrative of tension and resolution. That is how you move the human heart.
The mechanics of persuasion have not changed because human nature has not changed. But if we connect this to the bigger picture of where our society is heading today, it raises a final provocative thought.
Lay it on us.
We live in an age where artificial intelligence can instantly generate perfectly structured logos. It can write a flawless, logically sound argument in 3 seconds. It can even be trained to mimic pathos, generating stories and narrative loops that pull at our heartstrings. In a world where the words themselves, the arguments, and the stories can be artificially perfected by a machine, perhaps we are entering an era where a speaker's ethos, their actual lived moral integrity, their vulnerability, and their proven authenticity behind the microphone is the only thing that will truly persuade a skeptical human heart.
The machine can build the perfect velvet box, but only a human can hold the diamond. What does your ethos say before you even open your mouth?
That is the ultimate question for any communicator today.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. As you go into your week, I encourage you to listen to the presentations, the advertisements, and the speeches around you. See if you can spot the oops, aha loops in everyday life. See who is trying to bypass your logos. And remember, when you are trying to change a mind, it is never just a clean, engineered data transfer. You are stepping into the beautifully messy, explosive landscape of the human heart. Treat it with the respect it deserves. We'll catch you on the next deep dive.